stayed up there 6 months ago, there was a statistic I read about that school, which was considered a good school, probably an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 on the rating. But
okay.
of that, in school suspensions, you can go, if you kind of dig, and you can dig into different school websites. 96% of in-school suspensions were made up of 7% of the student body, or came from 7% of the student body. And that 7% entirely either African-American or mixed-race children. And I remember reading that and seeing that and just crying, bawling, going, my child is that 7%. My sons, I have two mixed-race sons, my sons will automatically be put into that group. They are the 7%, which has become the 96%. And so when we talk about systemic injustice, that is an example that something in our school systems, and I would go so far as to not just say school systems, but I do a lot of work in the spiritual realm, so I would say it's the same in churches, and in religious or spiritual systems, but in which something is happening there that is not benefiting every single one of our children, and therefore every single life. So that is an example of what my father-in-law said in 1962, and I can't now do the math. I'm sitting here going, okay, that would be almost 70 years ago, right? That would be 60 years ago. I was a high school English teacher, not a math major. But that's where I go. Until we don't have to talk about this, we have to keep talking about this. We have to keep having these conversations until we don't have to have the conversation anymore.
And these places that are coming, I mean, we have these little pockets of hope, like The Wall, like the Imaginary Wall film, like your book. We have people starting to talk about racism in a way that opens up dialogue, that opens up a forum of healing, that opens up people where it doesn't place one against the other or on different sides of the fence. Sure, it certainly does still exist, unfortunately, but luckily we have these pockets of hope. Now, so you're very candid in your book about areas of your life being a white woman, and I don't mean, we're a culture that objectifies. I'm sorry. We just are, okay?
Sure.
And as I'm objectifying even you by calling you a white woman, I want to talk about your candidness in the book, about how you felt about certain things, because as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, oh, you poor thing, how you must, I mean, sure, I would have been oblivious to objectifying as well, or certain aspects as well that you also went through, like choosing Ebony and Ivory as your wedding song and then feeling like that wasn't right. I mean, why don't you feel that was right? Let's talk about that, because first off, I feel, on the front of my brain, I think, oh, what a beautiful song to pick.
Sure.
And then as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, okay, so apparently that offended. So let's talk about how that offended. Where does the offense come in with that song being picked for your wedding song, as you, a white woman, and your husband, a black man?
Absolutely. To be totally honest, / continue in the candid thread, my husband didn't want that song because he didn't feel like it was a good dance song.
Okay.
So that was kind of James's thing. I mean, we try to have family dance parties every single night. But part of my with our family, it's our favorite. But part of it for me, a big part of my journey, and I would say this is a big part of our journey, especially for those of us who are just stepping into conversations of race, no matter how we identify racially or ethnically or culturally. but I continue to just see things from the outside. And so there are several instances in the book in which I'm just seeing the outer layer. I'm just seeing the icing on the cake. And I'm thinking in seeing that somehow that seeing is solving the problems of the world. I'm thinking that by James and I being an interracial couple, that somehow that'll just break down walls of injustice. That our love, because of what we look like on the outside, will somehow magically help people heal. So, but it's one of those that sometimes the outside doesn't help, and sometimes the assumptions that we make that aren't actually digging into the problem, those aren't actually helping the problem. So that song was somewhat of an example, but more so would have been when I started writing. And I, with all good intentions, because I was kind of the queen of good and moral intentions, I thought, I'll name my husband. I'll give him an online moniker called the HBH, Hot Black Husband.
Right.
That would be even more an example of objectification. Then when I got pregnant and started writing about my kids, both to protect them but also to provide a little bit of humor, I called them my little caramels. That would be an example of objectification. So, and those were later things, and I wrote about this in the book as well, that I realized this is not helping the conversation when I objectify my husband and my children and or any person with black or brown skin in this way, or anyone in general. When I'm objectifying and simply seeing someone by the outside of who they are, and calling them and owning them as such, this is not helping. So I think that was part of my journey, was also making public apologies, was also publicly asking us. And as far as it then went, I think maybe that's where we get to begin to see people. I mean, this is kind of kindergarten 101, right? But we get to again see people by who they are on the inside. And yes, we value and we respect the particularities of who they are, of their identity, sexually, of their gender, of their race and ethnicity and culture. But we also say, I don't need to label you by who you are on the outside from the get-go. And side note with that, I'll say this about – go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'll
You're
say
on a
this
roll.
about my process. I said this about my process with the book, with writing, but this book has been a journey. I've been off and on writing it for 5 years, and a year ago my first draft was due, and I didn't turn it in yet, but I printed it off and I gave it to writers. A lot of times authors will have what's called beta readers, which are early readers. They help give feedback, and so I finished it December, a little over a year ago, printed it off, gave it to probably 6 beta readers, a handful of both men and women, white folks, people of color, and I also printed one off for myself. And one of my beta readers, I'll never forget, she's a woman of color, and she said to me, Cara, I don't think you notice that you're doing this, but every time you talk about someone who is white, you do not name them. You do not identify them by the outside of their skin. You make an assumption that they are white and that your reader knows that they are white. But every time, and so you don't even say that, but every time you talk about a person of color, you identify them by the outside of who they are. So, and she said, you can't do that. And you have to learn how to tell the story and to honor every individual. So, by not objectifying them in that way, and also by not permeating what we would say, by not permeating whiteness, so to speak, because otherwise I was making an assumption of what's normal and of who's normal. So a lot of my rewrite included not necessarily saying or naming who people were by the outside of their skin, at least not initially. That was maybe something that came later if it was necessary, but it wasn't always usually necessary.
You know, it's interesting because as I was reading your book and as I'm talking to you now, it hits me many times that so much of this could have easily been curtailed had we been raised with the proper respect and kindness for one another. Because, I remember I wasn't raised in a racist household, but in going back, and I was raised with the ignorance that was held by white people because they weren't educated to the plight of the black people. And so, I grew up, I remember being 2 or 3 years old and hearing the word colored people. And I was so excited. I could not wait to meet these colored people. I thought that they had to be the most interesting, wonderful, beautiful colored people because that's what I didn't know what I was hearing, And I think to myself, so many ways we were raised with this ignorance that we have to be re-educated on a compassionate, kind level, but it was more out of ignorance rather than cruelty, There's this piece that I think being white families growing up in the 70s and the 80s, there was not a lot of communication about civil rights around the And so had there would have been that education. There would have been the dialogue of, objectifying, about how to communicate, about respecting. And I find that's an interesting call because it's certainly just not something that you would normally give respect to unless you knew, It's something that you should give respect to, but it's like you had to be taught that, and she opened your eyes to that. And I find that such a powerful teaching that she gave you.
Yeah, the interesting thing, just a little bit of history for your listeners. The interesting thing is that this colorblind rhetoric, that's what a lot of historians call it, but a colorblind rhetoric really was adopted in the 70s and 80s in school systems and in churches, especially alike, that in reaction to the civil rights movement and to all outward forms of racism and prejudice, the school systems in particular adopted believing themselves colorblind and or adopted thinking that was the way that they needed to operate. So they said, let's swing to the other side of the pendulum. Instead of being clear or outwardly racist, we're going to be colorblind. And so with that, that's where, I was a child of the 80s. I have a scene in my book in which I remember our principal standing up at the front of the gymnasium for a school-wide assembly, and all 600 students in the student body chanting along with him as he led us in a chant saying, "We are colorblind. We are colorblind." And I would think back to that, and again, all good intentions of the family in which I was raised, good intentions of the school system, good intentions of the church, all good intentions. But with
it's
that,
ironic.
I remember thinking, what would it have been like to be a child of color? And yet, I just was talking to a good friend who identifies as Black a couple days ago, and she said, well, I grew up with the same rhetoric. And she said, I grew up, and this is her story, and so I can't tell her story, but for her, she grew up with that same thing, and it wasn't until she was in high school that she began to wrestle with, well, what does it actually mean to not be colorblind and to see and to value color? But, I think that's even when it comes today, there was a study that I cite in my book, and this was also rewritten. There were so many drafts of this book, but for your readers or your listeners who do end up ordering it, when you get a copy of the book, look at the very end, the notes section, because many of the longer notes that are in there, that was actually one of the first drafts. And my editors came back to me and they said, it is wonderful that you are trying to teach people all the things that you've learned and that they need to learn, But they said number one, you're not an expert. You're a fellow